There's a quiet moment a lot of people have with money, usually late at night. You're scrolling through your banking app, maybe checking your balance, maybe looking at a retirement account you opened years ago and barely touch. And somewhere in the back of your mind, there's this thought, I should probably start investing more seriously. But almost immediately, another thought shows up. Not yet. Maybe you're waiting until you make more money. Maybe you're waiting for the market to calm down. Maybe you're waiting until life feels a little more stable. So you tell yourself something that feels responsible. I'll start when the timing is better. And the strange part is, that sentence can follow someone for years. Not because they're lazy, not because they're irresponsible, but because the idea of the right time feels so logical that we rarely question it. And that's where things quietly go wrong. Because when it comes to investing, the right time most people are waiting for doesn't actually exist. If you ask most people why they haven't started investing yet, the answers usually sound reasonable. I don't make enough yet. The market feels risky right now. I want to learn more first. I'll start after I pay off a few things. On the surface, those explanations make sense. In fact, they sound responsible. But underneath those answers is something deeper. A belief that investing requires the right conditions, the right income, the right knowledge, the right market moment, the right stage of life. We imagine investing as something you do once everything else is finally sorted out. Almost like a graduation ceremony for adulthood. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people eventually discover. Life rarely reaches that moment where everything feels perfectly lined up. There's always something slightly unstable. A job change, unexpected expenses, market headlines, economic uncertainty, family responsibilities. So the idea of waiting until things feel right quietly turns into a form of delay. And delay in investing is rarely about intelligence. It's almost always about psychology, because starting to invest isn't just a financial decision, it's an emotional one. Part of the reason this myth is so powerful is that investing feels different from other financial decisions. When you save money, the result feels predictable. You put $500 into a savings account, you still have $500 tomorrow. When you pay off debt, the progress is clear. The balance goes down. But investing introduces something many people are deeply uncomfortable with: uncertainty. The value goes up and down. Sometimes, for reasons that feel completely random, you might invest money today and see the number lower next week. And that experience triggers something very human: loss aversion. Psychologists have studied this for decades. Losing money hurts more emotionally than gaining the same amount feels good. If you gain $1,000, you feel happy. But if you lose $1,000, the emotional weight is often twice as heavy. So your brain starts trying to protect you. It starts asking questions like, what if the market crashes right after I invest? What if I start at the worst possible time? What if I lose money I worked hard for? And those questions are powerful because they make waiting feel like the safer option. But here's the paradox. Waiting for certainty in investing is like waiting for calm weather before learning to swim. You might be waiting a very long time. Markets are always doing something unsettling. Sometimes they're falling. Sometimes they're rising too fast. Sometimes people are predicting recessions. Sometimes people are predicting bubbles. If you rewind history, you'll find something interesting. In almost every decade, there were convincing reasons to believe it was a bad time to invest. In the early 2000s, people were recovering from the dot-com crash. In 2008, the global financial system nearly collapsed. In 2020, the world shut down during a pandemic. And in every one of those moments, people asked the same question: should I wait? Some did, some didn't. And over time, the difference between those decisions became enormous. But what's important to understand is that the people who started investing during uncertain times weren't necessarily braver. Most of them were just tired of waiting. They realized something simple. The market doesn't reward perfect timing. It rewards time itself. There's a concept you've probably heard before called compound growth. But most explanations of compounding focus on the math. What they rarely talk about is the psychology. Compounding works quietly at first. In the early years, the progress can feel almost invisible. You might invest consistently for 3 years and feel like nothing dramatic has changed. Your account grows, but not in a life-changing way. And that slow start is exactly why so many people delay. Because the brain wants immediate feedback. It wants effort to produce visible results. But compounding doesn't work like that. It's more like planting a tree. For a long time, it looks like nothing is happening. And then, slowly, something changes. The growth begins to stack on top of itself. Returns, begin generating their own returns. And eventually, the pace becomes surprising. But here's the catch. Compounding needs one ingredient above everything else. Time. Not perfect timing, just time. Every year you wait to start investing is a year that compounding never gets back. And the strange part is, most people know this logically, but emotionally, they're still waiting for the right moment. Another reason the right time myth sticks around is because we misunderstand risk. People often think the biggest risk in investing is losing money in the short term. But historically, the bigger risk for most people has been something quieter, never investing at all, or starting so late that time can't do its work. Imagine two people. One person starts investing at 25. They don't invest huge amounts, just steady contributions. Another person waits until 35. Maybe they waited because they were paying off debt, or waiting for a higher salary, or waiting until they felt more financially secure. On paper, 10 years doesn't feel that dramatic. But in the world of compounding, those years matter more than most people realize. Because early investments have the longest time to grow. Money invested at 25 might compound for 40 years. Money invested at 35 compounds for 30. That difference doesn't feel emotional in the moment, but over decades, it becomes one of the biggest factors in long-term wealth. And this is where the myth of the right time quietly becomes expensive. Not because people make bad decisions, but because they wait for conditions that rarely arrive. There's another emotional layer here that doesn't get talked about enough. Starting to invest forces you to confront uncertainty about the future. When you invest, you're essentially saying, I believe my future self will need this. But thinking about the future can be uncomfortable, especially if your present life already feels stressful. Rent is expensive. Food prices keep rising. Work feels uncertain. Sometimes the idea of investing feels like trying to plan for a version of life that's hard to imagine. So people postpone the decision. They tell themselves they'll deal with it later, when things calm down, when life feels easier. But life rarely sends an email saying, congratulations, everything is now stable. The reality is that most people begin investing during imperfect chapters of their lives, during career transitions, during uncertain markets, during years when money still feels tight, not because it's ideal, but because waiting for perfect conditions eventually starts to feel more uncomfortable than starting imperfectly. At some point, many investors experience a quiet shift in perspective. They stop asking one question, is this the right time to invest? And start asking a different one. How long do I plan to stay invested? That change in thinking does something powerful, because it shifts your attention away from the next few months and toward the next few decades. When people focus on short timelines, every market movement feels dramatic. A drop feels like danger. A surge feels like urgency. But when you zoom out, the emotional intensity begins to fade. Daily fluctuations become background noise. Short-term uncertainty becomes part of the process. And investing starts to feel less like gambling and more like participation in a long system of growth. You realize something important. You don't need perfect timing. You just need a long runway. And once that realization settles in, the pressure to start at the right moment begins to disappear. Because the moment you start is simply the moment the clock begins. So, what does this actually look like in real life? For most people, starting to invest doesn't begin with a dramatic financial decision. It begins with something much smaller. Consistency. Not trying to predict the perfect market entry. Not trying to double your money quickly. Just building the habit of showing up. Many long-term investors automate their contributions, not because they're trying to outsmart the market, but because they're trying to outsmart their own emotions. Automation removes the temptation to constantly question timing. The money moves quietly in the background, month after month, year after year, and slowly, the system begins working without needing constant attention. Another important shift is accepting that the first few years of investing might feel underwhelming. That's normal. In fact, it's almost universal. The early stage of investing is rarely exciting, but the goal during that period isn't excitement, it's momentum. You're building a system that your future self will thank you for, and that system doesn't require perfection. It just requires participation. Some months will feel easier than others. Some years will feel uncertain. But investing has never been about predicting the perfect starting line. It's about staying on the path long enough for time to do what it does best. If you look back at the financial decisions people regret most, they usually fall into two categories: things they rushed into and things they waited too long to begin. Investing tends to live in the second category, not because people are careless, but because they care deeply about getting it right. They want the timing to be smart, responsible, safe. But the truth is, most long-term investors didn't begin at the perfect moment. They began at an ordinary moment. A moment when life was still a little messy. A moment when the future was still uncertain. They just decided that waiting for perfect conditions was a game that never really ends. So they started quietly, imperfectly, and then they let time do the heavy lifting. Because in the end, the most powerful investing decision most people make is simply deciding not to wait forever. Progress rarely looks dramatic while it's happening, but years later, when you look back, the small decision to begin often turns out to matter more than you ever expected. Not because it was perfectly timed, but because it finally allowed time to start working for you. And if this is the kind of conversation you've been needing around money, the calm, honest kind that doesn't try to rush you or overwhelm you, then consider subscribing. Because on this channel, we talk about the psychology behind money, the decisions that quietly shape your financial life, and the habits that matter over decades, not just the next paycheck. If that sounds helpful, you're always welcome here. And if this video made you think about your own relationship with money, I'd also love to hear your experience in the comments. Sometimes the most helpful insights come from realizing we're not the only ones figuring this out. Until next time, take it slow, and remember that progress with money rarely comes from perfect timing. It comes from small decisions that quietly move your life forward.